Welcome to the Old Mac Gang podcast, or OMG, a podcast with a panel of longtime Mac Apple users who want to discuss the most relevant apps and services to age-seasoned users. I'm Marty, an Apple enthusiast and podcaster, a 67-year-old age-seasoned user who's collected a great group of friends to talk about Apple and how seasoned citizens can use Apple and Apple products. Let's see who we have on the panel today.
Hey, good evening. I'm Chris Wesselman. I've been around the Mac for about 30 years, and actually 40. We just passed that marker. I got my 128K Mac in November of 1984, and then spent some years with the Apple user groups in Dallas, and then worked for Apple for about 8.5 years, and then moved on to a university out on the San Francisco Peninsula. And now I'm retired. I use an M1, a Mac Mini, and an iPhone 16 Pro, and an AirPad 9th generation. I got that right. And lots of Apple services too.
And I'm Peter. I'm a 72-year-old from Bay Village, Ohio, and loyal member of the Northeast Ohio Apple Club. I've been a foundryman, I've been a high school math teacher, and now I'm a retiree. I got my first MacBook Pro in 2006, but I did have a couple of gateway drug iPods before that. At the moment, I have an M1 MacBook Pro, an M4 13-inch iPad Pro, an iPhone 16 Pro Max, and a Series 9 Apple Watch as primary computing and devices and gadgets.
I'm Gary. I'm 87-year-old age-seasoned user. In 2004, I retired as a government auditor. That's the year I converted from PCs to Apple. In Cleveland, Ohio, I found 2 Apple user groups, which remain as my continuing education vehicle. At the Northeast Ohio Apple Corps, NEOAC, I found Peter and Marty. To keep my accounting skills relevant, I'm the treasurer for 3 small nonprofits. One of them is NEOAC. My goal is to share with you how I use my Apple products, primarily my iPhone 14 and my Mac Mini M2 with folks in my age group to make our daily lives, simple, efficient, and enjoyable. Today, I'm learning about AI, which is at the top of my list. Marty?
So, thanks for your introductions. We have a topic that was put forth by Peter, and I love it because I am busy and I forget about the podcast coming up, and somebody will say, hey, let's do this, and it's a great topic. Peter suggested that we look at maps, kind of focusing on Apple Maps and also Google Maps, because many of us switch between them. But since we started developing the show notes, there's a lot, when I think about it, there's a lot of map programs out there. And so we're going to start and ask sort of what map programs have you used or do you use now currently? And I think we go to Peter.
Yeah, I regularly and frequently use half a dozen. So mapping is a big part of my computer/gadget life. And the first couple are very familiar, Apple Maps and Google Maps. I also use Waze. I use AllTrails. And my last couple, well, they may sound like oddballs. The first one sounds like one, but isn't, and that's Strava. And the last one cultivates being both odd and surprising. It's called Atlas Obscura.
I've been using Apple Maps. I've been using Apple Maps once it kind of got a little bit better grounded here a couple of years ago. And I used to use Google Maps before that, but I also use Waze whenever there's a lot of traffic. And I used to use Gaia GPS for going off the grid. Sort of debating whether or not I'm going to continue that, but it's an excellent product, particularly if you visit national parks and forests and so on.
I've started switching to using Waze locally because I find that it helps me a little better even than Apple Maps, which is my primary maps, and Google Maps, of course. I also have found when I'm especially going someplace where I've never been before, I take a look at on my desktop rather than just the phone and punch it in when I'm about to drive. See where the location is, because as we all know, somehow somebody's formulated that you can get from point A to point B, but it's the way they're taking you, and it may not necessarily, especially locally, the way you may or may not go. So I find checking out the map, the big map on my monitor as well, and then putting it into usually in your directory, you put the address, hit go, and it finds it. So and Peter mentioned the trail map, which I too used when I was riding a bike. It's a very good map to use for that, and probably hiking too.
Yeah, I was curious about this because I thought of it after I'd put together the show notes and put my parts in. Did any of you ever use AAA Triptych?
Yeah.
That was the service that when they had
Back in the day.
often, I mean, this was when I first got married, because I know Aileen and I, when we would travel, we had AAA. We had it because we had really poor cars, and that was kind of the last defense. But, when they had offices, you could walk in and they'd have a wall of these things, and you'd say, well, I'm going to Denver. And they would just pull like sheets out and then stamp them together into one flip book to get you from Chicago to Denver. And so I would say my first map was really the AAA Triptych. And before that, as a kid, we'd go to Wisconsin, and my dad would keep us quiet by giving us the map to tell him directions he has to go. So we would follow the route along and pay attention to the road. But the Triptych was a fond memory of a really non-technology based app. I'm gonna share a little bit and then go into the next question. MapQuest is another one that I've used. Apple Maps, Google Maps, and Waze. And the next question is, how do you use them, and how do you make choices on which ones you use? Well, MapQuest for me, the only time I use it is when I have to figure out mileage for receipts for the university. So if I want to build that into the travel, I have to print out a statement of the mileage, like from my house to the airport. So I do it in MapQuest, print it out that way. It's still functional as any kind of map that you'd want to use, but it's pretty much restricted to my desktop. And that's the use I use it for. I'm really just to confirm mileage for business receipts and such. Apple Maps I like. Apple Maps also really frustrates me. The thing that I like about Apple Maps is the turn-by-turn that when you do, I find it difficult to set up directions in Apple Maps. It's kind of confusing for me. I can get a point, I can put in another point, and then it takes me to that other point. But actually setting up the directions is a bit of a challenge for me. But once I get it set, then I need to save it so I can quickly access it when I'm in my car. So I've been able to now do that with Apple Maps. It has turn-by-turn directions with the watch. So that's kind of a nice benefit. Since I have CarPlay in my car, I can put the maps up and it will follow through Apple Maps. And I generally like it and the information that it gives. And through CarPlay, I like the information that it gives. But Google Maps is a big contender for me. The thing that I don't have is I don't have a Google device that I carry with me. And I don't have an Android or Google-based watch that I can do the turn-by-turn with. So, but I've gotten in the city of Chicago, and the street mapping is much better in larger cities than it is on Apple Maps. It just seems to work better with Google Maps. It means changing my CarPlay over to that and then having to do things through a voice to generate Google to be able to get the directions I want to get through the city. So it's a little bit more complicated, particularly since I don't have an Android device that I can set that up with and then share it through CarPlay. Finally, Waze. Waze is a fun app to travel with. You can get all sorts of voice replies with Waze. So typically we set up the dog. So the dog will, as we're coming up in situations in traffic on the highway where there's an accident, the dog will go, "Oh, there's a car aside on the side of the road up ahead. Be careful. Maybe they've got some snacks." But it uses the same jokes over and over again. And after, 100 miles of the dog telling you about snacks, the joke runs out. And, there are voices that you can. I did a boy band on there one time and Aileen was like, "Shut that off." But there are other options for voiceover that you can do. Mr. T was one at one time that you could put on the device. I pity the fool that doesn't take a right turn up here. And so it's kind of a fun app. It also has this capability that you can report things along the route. So if you cross an exit, and I know Apple, I think, has started this now, that as you pass a place that they say there's a car stalled, it'll ask you if the car is still there, and then you can respond by touching on in my case, a touch screen I have in my automobile to confirm it. So it has this kind of social network community that's helping everybody, on the road that you're going on. That's kind of nice. So those are the ones that I use and for the different purposes that I use them for. Gary, any of these that you use in travel and setting travel up?
No, I mostly use Apple Maps, but I did have a problem with Google. I went only once to Burlington, Vermont in April of 2023. And then I left to come home like at the end of the day because we closed up this office. And for some reason, there was some button. It started to rain also. And I was driving back from Burlington to Cleveland. And I wanted to get off of 90 at a part, but Google Maps I must have hit something, kept taking me back on the freeway or on the interstate. And when, as I said, when I don't really know where I am, I don't feel as comfortable. But back to Apple Maps. So locally, as you said, with the watch, and I think as Apple and others have done, it continuously improves the voice and the directions and reminding you to turn right or take this lane. But I think it's wonderful. I don't know how you would travel, and especially visiting somebody at night in a cul-de-sac to maybe you could get there, but to get back out, it's a great tool to have.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point. How did we used to do this before the technology? And I can't remember how we used to do this. I mean, we did get there, obviously, and I couldn't be reading a physical map while I was driving, although I'm sure there are people who did that or held it up on their steering wheel to try and read over the directions and which way they should go next. We paid a lot of more attention. I think we paid more attention to street signage, and we had to on the highway. But all of that being said, I still wonder how we were able to do it. And are we able to do it now distraction free? I mean, that's what I like about the haptic on the watch, that I programmed it in. I can look over at my screen, but if my wrist starts bumping, I can turn my watch and realize, yeah, I've got to take this right coming up in 450 feet. Chris.
Yeah, one thing about Google Maps, and which is, I think you were sort of alluding to, Marty, is that it's a little bit more granular and there's a little bit more detail. Like if I'm looking for a particular store or what's on a particular block of businesses, I can look at that in Apple Maps and it'll have most of them. There will be more if I drill down in Google Maps. And I typically, just have it as an app on my CarPlay. I've got a pretty simple CarPlay in a 2018 Nissan Rogue. And so I can just tap the icon for Google Maps. And one thing I did, which is a little different, is I switched that to metric. And the reason is I was a soccer player in high school, and I'm very knowledgeable about what 100 yards is. Or, of course, it's 100 meters, really. And so, when I have a turn coming up and it's like 3/4 of a mile, that just doesn't compute to me. Whereas if it says it's like, 800 meters or something, I know exactly what that is. Like that's 8 soccer fields. So, that's very handy. Now, my wife absolutely hates that. And so, we keep Google Maps and the normal miles and so on. And one thing I found recently, which was unexpected, I had Waze running, and then I asked Siri for directions, and it said using Waze. And it went right through to Waze instead of to Apple Maps, which I found interesting. I don't recall if my watch did that haptic, so I don't remember. I'll have to check that. But so that's kind of a cool thing. And I definitely like Waze for, heavy traffic. I mean, if I'm really in a hurry and I really want the fastest way, I will always use Waze because it'll be faster. And once in a while, Apple Maps will route something that's like, okay, I know the road with less traffic that doesn't have commercial stuff on it. It's more residential, but it's still pretty fast. And, versus the boulevard thing with lots of businesses. And Apple Maps will usually take the most direct route, which may not be the fastest. I'm trying to think of anything else. Yeah, I think that's about it. But there are possibilities, I think, for all of them. And, people can try them out and see which one works best for them. In certain situations, everybody like driving through LA freeways or somewhere that's really congested. Everybody's got their favorite maps for that. I found some years back that Apple Maps kept, like Gary was saying, Apple Maps kept routing me back onto the freeways with the most traffic, and where I had choices. And I was thinking like, oh, what's this all about, And that's when my older son said, Dad, you got to use Waze. So I've been using that ever since.
You mentioned Gaia GPS. Can you talk a little bit about that? You said it's great for
it's Gaia. It's Gaia GPS. I actually heard about this through a friend's nature photography SIG, and he is a great off-roader and four-wheel drive person, and it works. And I'm not sure quite how it does it, but it has a lot of offline maps. And like if you're going to, like a national forest, I'm trying to think of some of the smaller ones, even some of the state parks, where they'll have those maps included in. Now, it is a fairly expensive subscription. The last time I renewed, it was around $40, but it's got all sorts of offline stuff. And there are some roads here in Arizona southeast Arizona, where I live in Tucson, where if we go far enough, we can kind of get off the grid. And so I'm experimenting with the offline maps and Apple Maps to see if that's really going to kind of do it for me. Otherwise, you just see you're moving along the road and the highway, but you don't see anything else. And so at that point, if you want to reroute and say, well, how far am I from my destination? It may just say it's offline. And so it'd be interesting to see going forward with the satellite stuff, if we're going to how much we're going to be able to pick up. And I'm not sure how Gaia does it, if they use the GPS in the phone, or maybe I should look into that and get back to you on it.
Yeah, I've making choices, because many of these apps will give you, here's 3 routes that you can go to the destination, and here's the one that we think you should take. This is pretty typical with Apple Maps. And I routed myself to a doctor's appointment, and the doctor's appointment, I like my appointments early in the morning, just get them out of the way. The problem was winter in Ohio, early in the morning means pitch black. And they took me through a wooded area, weaving around roads with very little street lamps or lights for me to see where I was going. And obviously everybody else on that route was very familiar with it. So I was feeling crushed doing that route in the darkness. So sometimes you have to make common sense judgment. And the other option was the expressway. I don't want to do that. So the middle option was a little longer, more stoplights, but well-lit area that time in the morning for me to be able to get to my destination. Peter.
Yeah, I have a specific use for each of the apps I mentioned, but I'll make a quick confession first, and that is that I do not use CarPlay because I don't have it in my car. That's going to change in another month. I have used CarPlay in my wife's car, so on big trips, but I mainly mount my phone to the dash, and that's what I'm used to looking at. I use Apple Maps for, I guess, what I would call routine use. There's a place that I don't know. It's going to get me there, and it's going to tell me how am I doing getting there. And I love the graphics of Apple Maps. I think it's the most glanceable app to look at something and not look at it too long. I think it interacts with podcast, audiobook, music players the best, ducks the music, pauses the books and podcasts. It's great. When I'm planning, I'm probably more likely on my computer and I'm using Google Maps because I like the specifics I can get about a destination. If it's a store, I can jump easily into hours, people's comments about it, things like that. If it's a place I think I'm going to have trouble finding, I can jump into Street View and print myself out a picture that I have or put it somewhere where I can grab it. And it will also show, as Chris said, lots of nearby things that I think are pretty important. Waze is the mapping app I use when I don't have any destination. Just I'm going places I know. I think it has the best heads-up display for showing you what's ahead, coloring the roads if there's going to be traffic jams and things like that. It's optimal. Another app I use in planning is AllTrails, and it will do parks and things like that, offer spots. I'm not subscribing to it at the moment, but if I went to national parks or something like that, I'd probably kick in a subscription for the time I was there. It helps me find hiking spots. And when I say it helps me make a map. So in the places I'm very familiar with, the walking trails might be on some of the other mapping systems, but there are other paths through the woods that if I trace them, I can then make a map of that and then follow that again in the future, which I like to do. The one that I said doesn't sound like a mapping app I used to use for that purpose. It's called Strava. It's really for athletes. So I no longer use it to make maps. I no longer use it to check in and show my wife or daughter or friends where I am while I'm out on my walk, which I used to do. But it does have a social aspect where lots of my daughter, some of my nieces and nephews, some of my friends, I see where they go, they see where I go, and we sort of encourage each other to do a better job at biking and hiking and things like that. And the last app, which I wanted to mention for planning, and particularly vacation planning, is this one called Atlas Obscura. It's focused on finding startling and wonderful and oddball places for you, places you won't find in photos or Lonely Planet or any of the books that I used to use back in the days of triptychs. Frommers, I guess that's the other one.
Yeah.
But I like using that to add a couple of things that, they might be terrible, but they might be wonderful, and go visit them when I'm off on a vacation. So that's all of what I use and why.
Well, what I'd like to do is share with our viewers and talk a little bit for our listeners about some of the websites of some of these apps. And guys, just jump in because I know you threw some things in here and would love to get your sound about the different things that are here for our viewers. I put together 4 or 5 articles that are for people who want to compare the aspects of Apple Maps and Google Maps. And so the first 4 or 5 articles are going to be just that. And this is a Tom's Guide article. Google Maps versus Apple Maps, which navigation app is the best? And it gives you some details about the availability and where where the maps are available for and what parts of the world they're available, the interface and the design of both of the interfaces. So all of these references, all of these links to the articles that we're talking about will be in the show notes for both the video and the audio version of this stream. So you can find them, the links directly in the show notes, so you can go and take a look at it. Apple Maps versus Google Maps versus Waze, the best navigation apps for 2025. And this is coming from PC Mag. It's a article that does and makes picks on which ones are the best and for what reasons, with the pros and cons on them and what's missing from them in particular. Then 4 things Apple Maps does better than Google Maps. This is an article off Wired. Being a little Apple-centric, I think, in this podcast, I'm sure there are articles that talk about how Google Maps does things that Apple doesn't do, but I thought I'd put this article in. The author talks about how it had its disastrous launch in 2012 with Apple Maps, and how they switch between both of them. And then I think a Apple Maps is better than Google Maps article. This comes out of motor1.com, I guess primarily for interest in driving, and some information on that regarding. Then I just put links in for Apple Maps, so the apple.com/maps, and then also one for Google Maps. And what you get here with Google Maps, at least when I sign on to it, is it knows my location. So you now know, as you probably already do, that I live somewhere in Ohio, in Kent, Ohio, and then Gary and Peter are also part of this regional place. But Google Maps seems to open up to that, particularly when you have your location information in Chrome. It'll show up there. Then the link for Waze. Waze is free. Does it have in-app purchases, though? Doesn't say it.
I don't think so. Google owns Waze at this point.
Oh, Google owns Waze, yeah. But I thought you could, I think within the app, I don't know, you could purchase different kinds of narrations at one point. And that might be prior to Google owning them. And then AllTrails. Peter, did you talk about AllTrails?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's mainly it's for adventurers, I would guess, and athletes, but mainly hikers, I guess I would say, trail riders, and it identifies lots of those. It has extensive maps that are not available in the others, although both Google and Apple have been adding walking trails and things like that and having ways for you to highlight them. It does cost money, as you can see, and it's not inexpensive. But as I said, I do not subscribe. And when I'm going to take a vacation, I'll spend some money and consider it part of my vacation expense to kick out on for whatever the minimum period I can do. It shows everything on your screen is $36.
$36, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me I've paid $15 to get it for a month or two, but maybe I'm misremembering.
And then Strava. This is the biking app, basically, or the athletes app?
It's athletes, runners. It's used more by runners than anything else, but cyclists have started to pick it up quite a bit. And it does have a pay tier, but the pay tier is mainly a safety feature to inform, your loved ones where you're at when you're on a. And again, that's the kind of thing where I used to kick it on for 3 months in the summer and pay $36 over the summer, and then I kick it back up. I do not subscribe at the moment.
Yeah, and do you really want your loved ones to find you is the question.
Well, actually, that's an interesting story because we always hear about Chinese spying, and you don't have to spy too hard. They would look at running routes near military bases, and they would see all kinds of where soldiers and people at those bases, or even near places like the NSA and stuff like that. And they would get a pretty good idea of what the building was and who went there and all that kind of stuff. And I think some of the governmental entities made some changes for their personnel at that time. Covered.
And the last app, for some reason, I am having a hard time getting into. It's Atlas Obscura, and it's not letting me get to the site right now for whatever reason. But that was
They do have both an app and a website. I probably use the app more once I get to somewhere and I look at what's near me. although I do sometimes if I'm planning ahead and don't have enough local museums, parks, what other things I might tend to go to, add a few in as I'm planning the trip.
Yeah, so this is
I also want to put in a vote for paper maps. I keep at least no more than 5-year-old Rand McNally of the United States in my car, as well as a official state map from all the states I frequent.
So
I know you can download maps to your phone, but if you don't remember to do it before you get in trouble, you're really in trouble.
Yeah, so if you get stranded somewhere and you don't know where you are, at least you've got something to burn and keep you warm, is what you're saying.
That too.
And get that iPhone out and get that satellite signal going. Yeah, but I like the idea of Atlas Obscura, because it's fun to go to places to see all the stuff that all the tourists see, but it's also fun to go to places to see some of the weird stuff that tourists don't know about. And so it makes the trip a little bit more special and memorable. I'm sorry, Gary, I cut you off. Did you have something?
Well, no, I don't use it, but I wanted to mention my son lives in Nashville and just drives interstate to Cleveland. And on Apple Maps, I think it told him to get off the interstate because there was a big tie-up, which he didn't do. And there really was a problem. But the next time and future subsequent times, he's been getting off and following what Siri tells him or whoever's doing the talking on Apple Maps. And that's been a time saver. So,
yeah, it's a little weird when you get those, get off here. It's like, no, I don't want to get off here. Am I supposed to trust you? I'm in somewhere in the middle of Tennessee and I don't know why you're taking me off this road. But it's a little scary that they know what's going on in traffic before you do and before you come up on it. There were some situations when I was going through Chicago, where they're doing some heavy construction. And the main artery of the expressway was clogged, and it kept telling me, go over these 2 right lanes, which actually are kind of on-off lanes. And I didn't. But then I, of course, watched all the cars in those 2 lanes move smoothly through the city of Chicago while I was stuck in the junket. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting how they're able to tap into the system. I don't know how they do that. Anybody have any knowledge on how they know traffic flow?
Yeah, they watch how the cars are moving of the ones that are talking to them, so they can just see different people.
Oh, wow, that's pretty cool. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share about travel experience?
Marty, I added the link for Gaia GPS, and it is similar to AllTrails. So people can check that out in the show notes. And I would say take a look at both of them and see which one might be better for you. I think they may be similarly priced, although I haven't really seen AllTrails in about 5 years. So dangerous to speak of old stuff anymore with everything changing as fast as it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's kind of similar.
Yeah, you mentioned too that you were suggesting, at least in the notes, and I think of it now, if they're all free, if Apple's free, Google's free, and Waze is free, try them all and see what use you might have as which one works for you. I'm tempted to try and figure out how to use Google Maps again as a travel item without having to make a dedication on my CarPlay, because CarPlay will switch over and then it'll kind of lock into that as the route, and then I lose my easy ability to switch over back to Apple Maps. But yeah, I'm tempted to continue to play with it.
Has AAA gone online with their maps and triptychs?
I don't know.
Somebody mentioned to me that they can actually get them online now. But since my towing is handled by a different insurance company, I don't really need AAA anymore.
I'm doing a quick search.
Much older.
Yeah, and I'm getting AAA Maps for the Road and Travel, AAA.com map gallery. And let me go ahead and throw this on. I think and Ohio. Let's go to destination. Let's go to Youngstown. Select cruise. I don't want cruise. I'm going to get a map. Okay, so this is what we've got, and I will try to. So it looks like it gives, static maps that you can download for different communities. And so I guess I could print this out, and then I could, look at the connectors and the expressways that are associated with it. But that's what I'm seeing.
Another one you might add, Marty, is the Apple check-in stuff. We could do a repeat on that for folks that use that.
Yeah, we could do a whole show on just the idea of how do you let loved ones know that you're there or that you've arrived. And I was on
Apple Maps, you can share your ETA with anybody as you're approaching, and that's a nice thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The only thing is that it really is kind of repetitive for the receiver of that information. Have you ever been on the receiving end? Yeah.
I have. Well, they make a gas pit stop, and then it corrects the time and changes when they're going to be there.
Yeah.
But it is a good deal, though. I use it a lot.
I like to know when people are showing up at my doorstep. It just tells me how many more floors I can sweep before they show up to get the dog hair up. Well, let's wrap it up for this episode. Our next live episode will be Wednesday, February 6th at 9 p.m. through YouTube, where you can watch this crew at youtube.com/@OldMacGang. You can always pick up the podcast through any of your podcatch services. If you miss the live show, or you can watch the video on YouTube if you want to see all of us in our glorious spaces and the websites that we're looking at. Our music bed is by Philip Gross, Marrakesh, courtesy of the Free Music Archive. More information about this podcast and others can be found at thepodtalk.net. Thanks to the group, Gary, Chris, Peter, and right now an absent Bob, who I think is returning home and in flight somewhere. But I think Bob's going to be back next week, so we'll be back to a crew of 5. Thank you for being part of the Old Mac Gang, and we'll see you next time.